A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The candle on Seraphina's desk had burned down to a stub, the wax pooling across the scarred wooden surface like tears she refused to shed, and her eyes felt like someone had rubbed sand beneath her eyelids after 12 straight hours of transcribing legal documents in handwriting so cramped and faded that deciphering each word felt like solving a particularly cruel puzzle designed by someone who actively hated anyone who might need to read their work in the future. Her long, silver hair, which fell to her waist in waves that caught the flickering candlelight and turned it into something that looked almost magical if you were the romantic type, which Seraphina decidedly was not, hung over her shoulder in a messy braid that had started the day neat and orderly, but had slowly unraveled as the hours wore on, much like her hopes of actually making enough money this month to cover both food and rent, a combination that seemed increasingly like an impossible luxury. The cottage around her was small and drafty, with gaps in the walls that let in the cold mountain air and made the candle flame dance and sputter, threatening to go out entirely and leave her in darkness, which would be fitting, really, because darkness seemed to be the theme of her life lately, or perhaps always, depending on how far back you wanted to trace the pattern of rejection and isolation that had defined her existence from the moment she took her first breath and her mother took her last. She set down her quill, flexing fingers that had cramped into a claw-like position from gripping the worn wooden handle for so long, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to close her eyes and imagine a different life. One where she wasn't the cursed girl with the ghost-pale appearance that made people cross to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. One where her father was still alive and still telling her stories about ancient mate bonds and true love, while they sat by the fire in the royal archives where he used to work before everything fell apart. One where she belonged somewhere and to someone and didn't spend every single day fighting just to survive in a world that had made it abundantly clear she was not wanted, not valued, not even really tolerated, except when her transcription skills were needed, and even then people preferred to leave the documents on her doorstep rather than actually interact with her directly. The 30 seconds ended, as they always did, and Seraphina opened her eyes to the same reality she'd been living for the past 2 years since her father died, which was to say a reality of overwhelming loneliness, punctuated by moments of such acute awareness of her own isolation that sometimes she forgot how to breathe properly and had to remind herself that air went in and out, just keep going, because giving up wasn't actually an option no matter how appealing it sometimes seemed. The knock on her door came just as she was reaching for the next document in her pile, and her whole body went tense with a familiar dread, because knocks after dark were never good news. They were landlords demanding rent, or villagers complaining about something she supposedly did wrong, or occasionally drunk wolves who thought a woman living alone was an invitation for harassment, until she showed them the silver dagger her father had given her and the knowledge of exactly where to stick it if they didn't leave her property immediately. She stood slowly, her joints protesting from sitting in the same position for so long, and moved toward the door with the kind of careful deliberation that came from years of being ready to defend herself at a moment's notice. Her hand, already sliding toward the dagger she kept in her belt, even though she was wearing her nightdress under a worn robe, because she'd given up on maintaining appearances when there was no one around to see them anyway. When she opened the door, she found not her landlord or a drunk villager, but someone she'd never seen before, a man in formal livery that marked him as working for someone important, someone with money and power and all the things that people like Seraphina would never have, and his expression when he looked at her went through the familiar progression she'd seen 1,000 times before, which started with professional politeness and then shifted to startlement when he registered her appearance and then settled into barely concealed discomfort as he tried to figure out how to interact with someone who looked like she'd been carved from moonlight and ice and all the cold, untouchable things that made wolves nervous. He cleared his throat, his eyes sliding away from her face to focus on a point just over her left shoulder, and held out a sealed letter with hands that trembled slightly, as if even touching something she might touch was dangerous, as if her strangeness might be contagious. The seal on the letter was unfamiliar but clearly official, pressed into deep red wax that gleamed in the candlelight, and when Serafina took it from him, making sure their fingers didn't actually make contact because she'd learned that lesson years ago, her gift flared to life in a way it hadn't in months, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air and everything to do with the sense that this piece of paper was going to change everything. The messenger left without a word, practically running back to his horse as if he couldn't get away from her cursed presence fast enough. And Serafina closed the door with a quiet click before moving back to her desk, the letter clutched in hands that had started shaking for reasons she couldn't quite name. She broke the seal carefully, her fingers tracing over the wax as her gift whispered things she couldn't quite interpret yet. Just a sense of significance and deception and something hidden beneath layers of formal language that her ability to read truth in written words was trying to unravel. The letter was written in the kind of elaborate script that spoke of professional scribes and important people who had better things to do than write their own correspondence. And as Serafina's eyes tracked across the words, her heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in her temples, where a headache was already forming. It was a marriage contract, spelled out in legal terms so formal and binding that even without her gift, she would have known this was serious. This was real. This was the kind of document that could not be broken once signed without consequences that would destroy whoever tried to back out. The terms were laid out with brutal efficiency, offering her a substantial sum of money in exchange for agreeing to become the contractual mate of an unnamed alpha of significant status, with duties that included producing heirs if required, and fulfilling all social obligations expected of a mate in her new station. And the payment being offered was enough to clear every debt her father had left her, enough to live comfortably for years, enough to never worry about rent or food, or whether she'd freeze to death in this drafty cottage when winter truly set in. She read the contract 3 times, her gift working overtime to parse through the layers of meaning, and what it told her made her stomach twist with a combination of hope and dread that felt like swallowing broken glass. The contract was legitimate and binding, written in accordance with ancient pack law that even modern councils couldn't override, but there was deception woven through it like poison through honey. Clauses that said one thing on the surface while hiding completely different intentions underneath, and the identity of the alpha she'd be marrying was conspicuously absent in a way that suggested deliberate obfuscation rather than simple oversight. Her gift couldn't tell her who he was or what his true intentions were, only that this contract was part of something larger, something political and complicated and potentially dangerous. But it was also her only way out of the slow death by poverty and isolation she was currently experiencing. She had 24 hours to decide, according to the letter, 24 hours to choose between signing away her autonomy to an unknown alpha for financial security or continuing to scrape by alone in this cottage until eventually the landlord made good on his threats to evict her, and she ended up homeless and starving on the streets where people would step over her pale, strange body without a second glance, because that was what happened to wolves who didn't belong anywhere. Serafina stood and paced the small confines of her cottage, her silver hair swinging behind her like a pendulum marking the seconds of her internal debate, her mind racing through every possible angle and outcome while her heart that traitorous organ she'd thought she'd trained into submission years ago, whispered dangerous things about how maybe this was her chance. Maybe this was the moon goddess finally throwing her a lifeline instead of another stone to drag her further underwater. She thought about her father, about the stories he used to tell her when she was small, and still believed the world might have a place for someone like her. Stories about true mates and bonds that transcended politics and appearance. About love that saw past the surface to the soul underneath. And she wondered what he would tell her to do if he were still alive. If he would counsel her to take this chance, or to run as far and as fast as she could from anything that felt this much like a trap disguised as salvation. His voice echoed in her memory, warm and patient, and full of a wisdom she missed so desperately. It felt like a physical wound that never quite healed, telling her that sometimes survival required accepting help, even when it wounded your pride. But to never accept anything that cost you your soul. And she tried to figure out if signing this contract would cost her soul or save what little of it she had left. The candle finally guttered out completely, plunging the cottage into darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the gaps in the walls. And Serafina stood in that darkness with the contract clutched in her hands and made her decision with the kind of grim determination that came from having no good options and having to choose the least bad one. She would sign it. She would become the contractual mate of whatever Alpha had purchased her like a piece of property. And she would survive because that was what she did. That was what she'd always done. She survived when the world tried to crush her, and she would continue surviving, even if it meant selling herself into a marriage that had nothing to do with love or choice, or any of the beautiful things her father used to describe. She moved through the darkness with the familiarity of someone who'd lived in this cottage for 2 years, finding fresh candles and lighting one with hands that barely shook anymore. And then she sat at her desk and pulled out her own quill, the one her father had given her when she was 15, and just beginning to develop her gift for reading truth in written words. And she signed her name at the bottom of the contract in handwriting that was clear and steady, even though her heart was screaming at her to stop, to reconsider, to do literally anything else. The moment the ink dried, her gift flared one final time, showing her a flash of something she couldn't quite interpret. A sense of silver hair that matched her own, and ice blue eyes, and a presence so powerful it made her wolf, who had been quiet and subdued for years, suddenly lift its head with interest. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping and confused, and wondering if she'd just imagined it, or if her gift was trying to tell her something important about the path she'd just committed herself to walking. She sealed the signed contract back into its envelope, her fingers trembling now that the decision was made and couldn't be unmade, and set it on the table to be collected by whoever would come for it. And then she sat in the candlelight and tried not to think about how in 3 days she would leave this cottage and this village and this life behind to go to some unknown place with some unknown Alpha who had enough money to buy a bride, but apparently not enough interest to even meet her first. Sleep was impossible that night, her mind churning with thoughts and possibilities and fears that multiplied in the darkness like wolves gathering for a hunt. And when dawn finally broke and painted her cottage in shades of gray and gold, Serafina stood at her window and looked out at the village that had never wanted her and felt nothing. No sadness at leaving, no attachment to the place that had only ever seen her as a curse to be tolerated. Just a kind of hollow emptiness where emotions should have been. The messenger returned at midday exactly as promised, collected the signed contract without meeting her eyes or speaking a single word to her, and handed her a purse heavy with the first installment of her payment, enough coins that she could finally pay her landlord and the merchants she owed, and still have enough left over to buy supplies for whatever journey was coming. She spent the afternoon settling her debts with grim satisfaction, watching the surprise on people's faces when the cursed girl with the ghost-pale appearance actually had money for once, and she packed her few belongings into a single trunk that held everything she owned in the world, which was mostly books her father had left her and clothes so worn they were more patches than original fabric. On the third day, exactly as the letter had promised, a royal carriage arrived at her cottage door, gleaming black with silver accents that caught the morning sun, and announced without words that whoever had sent it was important, was powerful, was the kind of person who could change Serafina's life with a single decision. The servants who accompanied the carriage treated her with the same cold courtesy the messenger had shown, loading her trunk without comment and gesturing for her to enter the carriage as if she were a package being delivered rather than a person making a life-altering journey. And as Serafina settled into the plush interior that was nicer than any place she'd ever sat in her entire life, she allowed herself one final look at the cottage that had been her prison and her refuge for the past 2 years. Maven appeared at the last moment, her only friend in this village, a young mother who had shown Serafina kindness even when everyone else treated her like a curse, and she pressed a small package into Serafina's hands through the carriage window, with tears streaming down her face and a whispered plea to write, to stay safe, to remember that someone in this world actually cared whether she lived or died. The carriage began to move, pulling away from the only home Serafina had known since her father died, and she clutched Maven's package to her chest and watched the village disappear behind them with the strange sense that she was leaving behind not just a place, but an entire version of herself, the desperate girl who'd been willing to sign a contract with a stranger just to survive. And ahead of her lay something unknown and possibly dangerous, but also possibly, just maybe, something that might give her life meaning beyond simple survival. The journey would take 5 days according to the servants. 5 days of traveling through territories she'd only read about in her father's books. 5 days of wondering who she was going to meet at the end of this road and whether the alpha who'd purchased her would be cruel or kind or simply indifferent. And most importantly, 5 days to prepare herself for a life where she would be contractually bound to a stranger who might see her pale, unusual appearance and regret his decision to buy a bride sight unseen, because surely whoever had arranged this contract had no idea what Serafina actually looked like. Surely they'd assumed she was normal, ordinary, someone who could blend into polite society instead of standing out like a ghost at a funeral. As the carriage carried her away from everything she'd ever known toward a future she couldn't predict or control, Serafina opened Maven's package and found a letter written in her friend's careful handwriting, telling her to be brave, to remember her worth, to know that she deserved happiness even if she'd never been allowed to have it before. And tucked inside the letter was a dried flower from Maven's garden, preserved perfectly as a reminder that beauty could survive even in harsh conditions. Serafina pressed the flower between the pages of her father's journal, the one possession she valued above all others, and made herself a promise that no matter what happened when she reached her destination, no matter who this alpha turned out to be or what he expected from his contractual bride, she would survive this too. She would find a way to thrive in whatever new prison she'd traded her old one for, because survival was what she did best, and no contract or alpha or political game was going to break her when poverty and isolation and a lifetime of rejection hadn't managed to accomplish that feat. The carriage rolled on through the afternoon and into evening, carrying her inexorably toward a destiny she'd chosen in desperation but couldn't escape even if she wanted to. And as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple, Serafina closed her eyes and tried not to wonder what kind of alpha would buy a bride without even asking to see her first. And more terrifyingly, what he would do when he finally laid eyes on his strange, pale, cursed contractual mate and realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The palace rose before Seraphina, like something out of the ancient stories her father used to read to her. All gleaming white stone and silver accents that caught the setting sun and transformed the entire structure into something that looked like it had been carved from starlight and moonbeams and all the cold, beautiful things that existed in the realm between dreams and reality. And as the carriage rolled through gates that were easily 3 times her height and guarded by wolves whose sheer size and presence made her feel like a child playing at being an adult, she realized with a sinking sensation in her stomach that whoever had purchased her contract was not just wealthy or important, but was someone who commanded the kind of power that made kingdoms bend and nations take notice. The servants who had accompanied her on the 5-day journey had maintained their careful silence throughout, answering her questions with the bare minimum of words necessary and treating her with a politeness so cold it felt like a weapon designed to remind her that she was not one of them, would never be one of them, was just a purchased bride being delivered to her new owner, like a piece of furniture that needed to arrive undamaged. And during those long days of travel, Seraphina had pieced together fragments of overheard conversations and careful observations until a picture began to form that made her blood run cold with a fear so profound she could taste it like copper on her tongue. She was being taken to the royal palace, the seat of power for the entire northern kingdom, which meant the unnamed alpha in her contract was not just any alpha, but someone connected to the highest levels of government, and possibly, though her mind tried desperately to reject this conclusion, even as the evidence mounted with each passing mile, someone who might actually be the Alpha King himself, the ruler who had taken the throne 7 years ago after his parents were assassinated, and who was known throughout the territories as brilliant and ruthless, and completely unmarried, despite the council's increasingly desperate attempts to find him a suitable mate. The realization had hit her on the 3rd day of travel, when she'd overheard 2 servants whispering about how the king had finally agreed to sign a marriage contract. How Lady Vivian from the royal council had orchestrated the whole thing. How nobody knew who the bride was or where she'd come from, but surely she had to be someone appropriate. Someone with the proper bloodline and training and appearance to stand beside the most powerful alpha in the known world. And Seraphina had felt her chest constrict with a panic so intense she'd barely been able to breathe because she was none of those things. She was a disgraced scholar's daughter with an appearance that made people cross the street to avoid her, and absolutely zero training in the kind of court politics and social maneuvering that would be required of someone in the position of Luna to the Alpha King. The carriage came to a stop in a courtyard so vast it could have held her entire village 3 times over. And Seraphina forced herself to take slow, measured breaths while her wolf, who had been unusually alert since they'd entered the palace grounds, paced restlessly inside her mind with an energy that bordered on agitation, as if sensing something Seraphina's human consciousness couldn't quite grasp yet. A woman in formal court attire appeared at the carriage door, her expression already arranged in a professional mask of welcome that didn't quite reach her eyes, and she introduced herself as Mistress Helena, the head of palace household management, speaking in the kind of crisp, efficient tones that suggested she had 100 other things she'd rather be doing than greeting a contractual bride who'd arrived looking travel-worn and exhausted with silver hair that had escaped its braid to fall around her shoulders in waves that caught the dying sunlight and probably made her look even more unnatural and strange than usual. Mistress Helena's eyes widened almost imperceptibly when she got her first full look at Seraphina's appearance, her gaze tracking over the pale skin that seemed to glow in the twilight. the silver hair that was clearly not dyed or enhanced, but completely natural. The eyes that shifted between silver and pale violet depending on the light and her emotional state. And Serafina watched the woman's professional composure crack just slightly as she struggled to hide her shock at discovering that the bride someone had selected for their king looked like she'd been born from winter itself and raised by moonlight. She was escorted through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past paintings of previous rulers and tapestries depicting great battles, and rooms that were each larger than the entire cottage she'd been living in. And with every step, Serafina felt more and more like she'd made a catastrophic mistake, like she'd signed away her life to something so far beyond her understanding or capability that she might as well have agreed to fly to the moon, or breathe underwater, or perform any other impossible task that would inevitably end in her complete and utter failure. The other palace staff they passed in the hallways all stopped to stare at her with varying degrees of shock and curiosity and poorly concealed judgment, their whispers following her like a shadow that grew longer with each passing moment. And she caught fragments of their conversations that confirmed her worst fears because they were talking about how the king had finally agreed to marry, how he was supposed to meet his contracted bride tonight at the formal presentation ceremony, how nobody had expected her to look like this, like something that belonged in legends and ghost stories rather than standing beside their powerful, commanding ruler who needed a strong Luna who could navigate court politics and bear strong heirs and represent their kingdom with grace and dignity. Mistress Helena led her to a suite of rooms that were so luxurious, Serafina almost laughed at the absurdity of someone like her being expected to live in such a place, with furniture that looked like it cost more than she'd earned in her entire life, and windows that overlooked gardens so perfectly manicured they seemed more like paintings than actual living plants. And the woman explained in that same crisp, efficient voice that Serafina had exactly 2 hours to prepare for the contract signing ceremony, where she would be formally presented to the court and to her intended mate, and that attendants would arrive shortly to help her dress and arrange her hair in a manner appropriate for meeting the Alpha King. The door closed behind Mistress Helena with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking, and Serafina stood in the center of that beautiful, suffocating room and felt the full weight of what she'd done crash down on her with such force that her knees actually buckled and she had to grab onto a nearby chair to keep from collapsing completely onto the marble floor that was so polished she could see her own pale reflection staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. She'd signed a contract to marry the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the entire Northern Kingdom, a male who could have literally anyone he wanted and who had somehow ended up with her through what was clearly a manipulation by this Lady Vivian person who probably had no idea what Serafina actually looked like, and was going to be absolutely horrified when she saw what kind of bride she'd accidentally selected for her king. The attendants arrived in a flurry of efficient movement. 3 women who maintained professional expressions, but couldn't quite hide their shock when they saw her up close, and they immediately began debating in hushed whispers about how to make her presentable, as if she were a problem that needed solving, rather than a person who could hear every word they were saying about how her hair was too unusual, her skin too pale, her entire appearance too strange to stand beside their king without making him look foolish. One of them suggested powdering her skin to make it look more normal. Another proposed dyeing her hair to a more conventional color, and the third actually had the audacity to say that perhaps they could claim she was ill and delay the ceremony until they could figure out how to make her look less like a curse and more like a proper Luna. And Serafina listened to them discuss her like she wasn't even in the room until something inside her that had been bending under pressure for years finally snapped with an almost audible crack. She stood up from where they'd seated her at the vanity, her full height, bringing her eye to eye with the attendants even, though she was small for an Omega, and she told them in a voice that was quiet but carried an edge of steel her father had taught her to use when people tried to make her feel less than human. That she would wear something simple and elegant, that she would not powder her skin or dye her hair or hide any part of her appearance, and that if the Alpha King had a problem with what his contractual bride looked like, then he should have specified his preferences before signing a binding agreement to marry someone sight unseen. The attendants looked at each other with expressions that suggested they thought she was insane, that nobody spoke to palace staff with such firmness, that she was going to get herself in serious trouble before she'd even officially arrived. But something in Serafina's eyes must have convinced them that arguing would be pointless, because they fell silent and brought out a selection of dresses that ranged from elaborately decorated gowns that looked like they weighed more than she did to simpler options that might actually allow her to breathe and move like a normal person. She selected a dress of silver silk that complemented her hair rather than trying to compete with it, something that flowed around her like water and made her look elegant without trying to hide or change what she fundamentally was. And she let them arrange her hair in a style that was formal enough for a royal ceremony, but didn't attempt to tame the natural waves that caught light and seemed to shimmer with their own internal glow. When they finally finished and stepped back to let her see herself in the full-length mirror, Serafina barely recognized the woman staring back at her, not because they'd transformed her into someone different, but because for the first time in her life, she was looking at herself dressed like she might actually be worth something, like she might deserve to stand in a palace instead of hiding in a cottage. And the thought was so foreign and uncomfortable that she had to look away before the tears gathering in her eyes could fall and ruin whatever cosmetics the attendants had applied to her face. Mistress Helena returned precisely 2 hours after she'd left, her expression suggesting she'd been expecting to find Serafina still arguing with the attendants about her appearance, but instead she found a woman who looked like winter royalty, dressed in silver silk, with hair that fell in artful waves and eyes that met Helena's gaze with a combination of terror and determination that made the older woman pause for just a moment before gesturing for Serafina to follow her to the throne room, where apparently the entire court had gathered to witness the Alpha King finally accept a contracted mate. The walk to the throne room felt like a death march, each step bringing Serafina closer to a moment that would determine the entire trajectory of her future, and her wolf was going absolutely wild inside her mind, pacing and whining and trying to communicate something that Serafina couldn't quite understand through the haze of her own fear and anxiety. The double doors to the throne room were massive and ornate, carved with scenes of historical battles and important moments in the kingdom's history. And as the guards pulled them open to reveal a room full of elegantly dressed nobles, who all turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to shock to barely concealed disdain, Serafina had to physically force herself to keep walking instead of turning around and running back to the relative safety of her assigned chambers. The throne room was enormous, with soaring ceilings and windows that let in the last rays of sunset to paint everything in shades of gold and orange and deep red. And at the far end of the room, on a raised platform, sat a throne that looked like it had been carved from a single massive piece of silver-veined marble. And in that throne sat a figure who was reviewing documents with an expression of such profound boredom and resignation that Serafina felt a flash of something almost like sympathy cut through her terror. She walked down the center aisle with her head held high, even though she could hear the whispers starting on either side of her. The shocked murmurs about her appearance, the speculation about who she was and where she'd come from, and what the king would think when he saw what his council had selected for him. And with each step, her gift flared and pulsed, trying to tell her something important about this moment, about this place, about the male sitting on that throne who still hadn't looked up from his papers. A woman in elaborate court dress who could only be Lady Vivian, stood near the throne with an expression of growing horror as she watched Seraphina approach, clearly realizing that something had gone terribly wrong with her careful plans, that the contracted bride she'd selected was not at all what she'd expected or intended. And Seraphina watched the woman's face go pale with the kind of panic that came from knowing you'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. The court official standing beside the throne cleared his throat and announced in a voice that carried through the suddenly silent room that the contracted mate had arrived and requested formal presentation to His Majesty the Alpha King. And Seraphina watched as the male on the throne set down his papers with a movement that spoke of deep exhaustion and complete disinterest, as if this was just one more tedious duty in a long list of tedious duties that made up his existence. He looked up, and the entire world stopped, time itself seeming to freeze, as ice-blue eyes rimmed with silver met violet-silver eyes that were wide with shock. And Seraphina felt something slam into her with the force of a physical blow. A connection so powerful and overwhelming that her knees actually buckled, and she had to lock them to keep from falling, right there in front of the entire court. The Alpha King, because of course it was him, of course her contract had been with the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, was staring at her with an expression of such complete and utter shock that his carefully maintained mask of royal composure had shattered entirely. And Seraphina watched as he stood abruptly, his tall, powerfully built frame rising from the throne with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for someone so large, and his silver hair, which was the same unusual shade as her own, caught the dying sunlight and seemed to glow with the same ethereal quality that had made people call her cursed her entire life. His wolf was visible in his eyes. She could see it rising to the surface with an intensity that made her own wolf respond, with a recognition so profound it felt like her soul was being torn in half, and the mate bond, which she'd never really believed in despite her father's stories, snapped into place between them with such force that she actually gasped out loud, the sound echoing through the silent throne room, where every single member of the court was watching this moment unfold with expressions of shock and confusion, and in Lady Vivian's case, absolute horror. The Alpha King's expression cycled through shock to wonder to something that looked almost like pain, and then he was moving, descending from his platform with steps that ate up the distance between them. And Seraphina stood frozen as he approached, her mind unable to process what was happening, because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be possible. She couldn't actually be the true mate of the Alpha King, because the universe was not that cruel or that kind. She couldn't decide which. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could see the fine details of his face, the sharp, aristocratic features, and the scars on his hands, and the way his chest was rising and falling with breaths that seemed as ragged and uncontrolled as her own. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name, asking her a question that cut through all the political maneuvering and careful planning and formal ceremonies to get to the heart of what was happening in this moment. He asked how it was possible that he'd signed a contract with his true mate without knowing, how the moon goddess had arranged for him to bind himself to the one person in the entire world who was made for him through what he'd thought was just a political arrangement, and his wolf was there in his voice, audible beneath the human words, whimpering and desperate, and completely overwhelmed by the recognition of its other half standing right in front of it, after years of searching and loneliness and resignation, to never finding what his parents had described. Seraphina opened her mouth to answer, to say something, anything. But before she could form words, the throne room erupted into chaos, nobles shouting, questions, and demanding explanations. Lady Vivian's voice rising above the others, insisting that there must be some mistake, that the contract should be reviewed, that surely this couldn't be allowed to stand. And through it all, the Alpha King, Lucian Silvercrest, according to the formal introduction the court official had given, was staring at Seraphina like she was the answer to a question he'd stopped asking years ago. Like she was water in a desert, or air to a drowning man, or any other desperately needed thing that appeared just when you'd given up all hope of ever finding it. His hand lifted as if to touch her face, to confirm that she was real and not just another prophetic dream that would dissolve when he woke. And Seraphina found herself leaning into that almost touch with a desperation that terrified her because she'd spent years building walls around her heart to protect it from exactly this kind of vulnerability. And now those walls were crumbling like they'd been made of sand instead of stone, washed away by the overwhelming tide of the mate bond that was singing through her veins and making her wolf howl with a joy so intense it felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. Lucian's voice, when he spoke again, was directed at the court, but his eyes never left Seraphina's face, and he commanded everyone to clear the room with an authority that made it clear this was not a request, but an order from their king. And Seraphina watched as the nobles filed out with expressions of shock and curiosity and speculation, as Lady Vivian tried to protest and was silenced by a look from Lucian that could have frozen fire, as the guards took their positions outside the massive doors and pulled them closed with a boom that echoed through the now empty throne room like a heartbeat. They were alone, Seraphina and Lucian, the contracted bride and the Alpha King, the true mates who'd found each other through manipulation and desperation and blind chance. And the silence between them was so charged with emotion and possibility and fear that Seraphina felt like the air itself might ignite from the intensity of what was building between them. Lucian's hand finally made contact with her face, his fingers trembling as they traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who radiated such power and authority. And when he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, raw with vulnerability and wonder, and a desperate kind of hope that matched exactly what Seraphina was feeling in her own chest. He told her that he'd given up, that he'd signed the contract because he'd stopped believing the mate bond was real, that he'd resigned himself to a political marriage with someone who wanted only his crown and his power. And he asked her with eyes that held 7 years of loneliness and disappointment and carefully buried longing, whether she felt it too, whether the bond between them was real, or if he was imagining it because he wanted it so desperately. And Seraphina found herself nodding before she could think better of it, found herself admitting that yes, she felt it, the pull that was trying to drag her into his arms, the recognition that sang in her blood and made her wolf dance with joy, the terrifying certainty that this male with his silver hair and ice-blue eyes was hers in a way that transcended contracts and politics and every rational thought in her head. But even as she admitted the bond's existence, even as she felt herself being pulled toward him like a moon caught in a planet's gravity, Seraphina forced herself to take a step back, to create physical distance that might give her the space to think clearly. And she saw hurt flash across Lucian's face before he controlled his expression back into something more neutral. And she knew she needed to say the things that were crowding in her throat, demanding to be spoken, before she let herself fall completely into this bond that she didn't understand and hadn't chosen. Not really, because signing a contract out of desperation wasn't the same as choosing a mate. She told him about the contract, about how she'd signed it because she was facing eviction and starvation, about how she'd never expected love or even basic kindness, just survival, and she watched his expression shift to something that looked like rage directed not at her, but at whoever had put her in a position where selling herself was the only option she had left. She told him about her father's exile, about being the cursed girl that nobody wanted, about a lifetime of rejection and isolation that had taught her not to hope for things like mate bonds and true love and belonging, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes because he knew what it meant to be alone, even when surrounded by people, to carry responsibility that isolated you from genuine connection, to build walls around your heart because letting people in only gave them the power to destroy you. She told him that she would honor the contract because she'd signed it and her word meant something even if nobody else's seemed to, but that she couldn't just throw herself into the mate bond without understanding what it meant, without knowing him as a person rather than just as the Alpha King, or as the other half of her soul. Because she'd spent too many years learning to protect herself, to abandon all caution now, just because the moon goddess said they were meant to be together. Lucian listened to everything she said without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. And when she finally fell silent, he took a slow breath and told her something that made her heart crack open in her chest, made all her carefully constructed defenses seem suddenly fragile and inadequate against the honesty in his voice. He told her that he understood her fear because he carried the same one, that he'd watched his parents die when their mate bond made them vulnerable, that his father had survived his mother's assassination by exactly 3 hours before his heart gave out, because living without his mate was literally impossible, and that Lucian had spent 7 years terrified of forming that kind of connection with anyone because losing them would mean his own death, and he had a kingdom depending on him to stay alive and functional. He told her that finding his true mate should have been the happiest moment of his life. But instead, it was terrifying, because now he had something to lose. Now he had a weakness that enemies could exploit. Now he had a reason to care about something beyond duty and responsibility, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant potential destruction. He told her that he didn't want to claim her because the bond demanded it or because the contract required it, that he wanted to give her time to choose him not as her king or her mate, but as Lucian, just a male who'd been alone for too long and who'd found the one person in the world who might actually understand what that loneliness felt like. The honesty between them was raw and painful and more intimate than any physical touch could have been, and Seraphina felt something shift inside her chest, felt the tiniest crack appear in the walls she'd built around her heart, because this male, who could command armies and rule kingdoms, was offering her the one thing she'd never had before, which was the freedom to choose without pressure or obligation or desperation driving her decision. Before she could respond, before she could figure out what to say to an offer that felt too good to be real, the doors to the throne room burst open with a crash that made both of them spin toward the sound, and Lady Vivian stood there with guards flanking her and an expression of cold fury on her face, declaring that she was calling an emergency council meeting to review the validity of the contract because clearly there had been a mistake. Clearly the Alpha King couldn't actually be expected to mate with someone so obviously unsuitable, someone whose appearance alone would make the kingdom a laughingstock. And she was looking at Seraphina with such undisguised contempt that it felt like being physically struck. The rage that flooded through Lucian at Lady Vivian's words was so intense that his wolf surged to the surface, his eyes flashing with the kind of primal fury that made even the guards who'd accompanied her take an involuntary step backward. And Seraphina watched as the Alpha King she'd been having such a vulnerable, honest conversation with transformed into something terrifying and magnificent. His entire presence expanding to fill the throne room with a dominance so absolute that the air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of his displeasure. He moved toward Vivian with steps that were controlled, but carried the promise of violence barely leashed, and his voice when he spoke was low and dangerous, each word enunciated with a precision that made it clear he was exercising enormous restraint to keep from simply ripping her throat out for daring to insult his mate in his presence. And he told her in terms that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation that she had overstepped her authority so catastrophically that she should be grateful he was a civilized king who believed in due process, rather than the kind of alpha who would execute her on the spot for treason. Vivian's face went pale, but she held her ground with the kind of desperate courage that came from knowing you'd already committed to a course of action that couldn't be reversed. And she argued that the contract had been signed under false pretenses, that she'd selected a candidate from the border villages based on reports of suitable bloodlines and appropriate training, and that clearly someone had switched the actual bride with this strange, pale creature who couldn't possibly be the Omega she'd carefully vetted for the position of Luna to the Northern Kingdom's most powerful Alpha. Seraphina felt the words like knives, each one designed to cut at the insecurities she'd carried her entire life, the certainty that her appearance made her unworthy of love or acceptance or basic human dignity, and she opened her mouth to defend herself, to argue that she'd signed the contract in good faith and had every right to be here. But before she could speak, Lucian's hand found hers, his fingers threading through hers, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fury still radiating from every line of his body, and he pulled her slightly behind him in a gesture that was protective without being dismissive, claiming her as his to defend while still acknowledging her right to stand beside him, rather than cowering in his shadow. His voice carried through the throne room with the kind of authority that came from 7 years of ruling a kingdom, 7 years of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, 7 years of learning exactly how to wield power like a weapon when necessary. And he declared that Seraphina was his true mate, that the bond between them had snapped into place the moment their eyes met, that the moon goddess herself had arranged for him to sign a contract with the one person in the entire world who was made for him, and that anyone who questioned his mate's worth or suitability was questioning his judgment as their king and would face consequences that would make them regret ever opening their mouths. The guards Vivian had brought with her shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they'd been manipulated into participating in what was essentially an attempted coup against their king's chosen mate, and Seraphina watched as they slowly backed away from Vivian, distancing themselves from her treasonous accusations, leaving her standing alone in the doorway with an expression that cycled rapidly through fear and fury and calculation as she tried to figure out how to salvage a situation that was deteriorating faster than she could adapt to the changing dynamics. Lucian wasn't finished, his anger building rather than dissipating as he realized the full scope of what Vivian had attempted, and he demanded to know exactly how she'd come to select Seraphina for the contract, what criteria she'd used, what research she'd done, because it was becoming increasingly clear that Vivian had intended to choose someone she could control, someone who would be grateful enough for the position that they'd allow her to manipulate them, and by extension, manipulate the king through his contractual mate. And discovering that the bride she'd selected was actually Lucian's true mate had destroyed all her carefully laid plans for maintaining her influence over the throne. Vivian's expression cracked, her composure finally shattering under the weight of Lucian's scrutiny and the realization that she'd been caught in a scheme that could very well cost her everything she'd spent years building. And she admitted with a desperation that made Seraphina almost feel sorry for her that yes, she'd selected someone she thought would be suitable, someone who would understand that being Luna was about supporting the king's decisions and maintaining the council's influence, and she'd never expected the moon goddess to actually give him his true mate, because true mate bonds were supposed to be rare, were supposed to be the stuff of legends and stories, not something that actually happened to real wolves in the modern world. The admission hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched, and Seraphina felt Lucian's hand tighten on hers as he processed the full magnitude of the betrayal, that his most trusted advisor had attempted to trap him in a loveless political marriage, had tried to deny him the one thing his parents had always told him was the most precious gift the moon goddess could give, had prioritized her own power over his happiness and the kingdom's future with such cold calculation that it bordered on the kind of treason that historically ended with executions. But before Lucian could pronounce judgment, before he could order Vivian arrested or exiled, or whatever punishment fit the crime of attempting to manipulate an Alpha King's mate bond, Seraphina squeezed his hand and stepped forward, moving from behind his protective stance to stand beside him as an equal. And she addressed Vivian directly, with a voice that was steady, despite the fear and anger churning in her stomach. She told Vivian that she understood the impulse to control what you couldn't predict, to try to manage outcomes through careful planning and manipulation, because Seraphina had spent her entire life trying to control the only thing she could, which was herself, her reactions, her expectations, her hope, all carefully managed and contained, because the world had taught her that reaching for more than survival was a good way to get hurt. She told Vivian that she'd signed the contract knowing it was probably a trap of some kind, that her gift had warned her there were layers of deception woven through the formal language, but that she'd been desperate enough to accept the risk because the alternative was slow death by poverty and isolation. And she didn't regret her decision, even though it had led her to this moment of standing in a throne room, being called unsuitable and strange by a woman who'd tried to use her as a pawn in a political game. Seraphina's voice grew stronger as she spoke, channeling years of anger at a world that had judged her for things she couldn't control. And she told Vivian that the moon goddess had arranged this exactly as it needed to happen, that Seraphina's desperation and Lucian's resignation and Vivian's manipulation had all combined to create the circumstances that brought true mates together when they might never have found each other otherwise, and that trying to undo what the moon goddess had put together was not just treasonous, but sacrilegious, an insult to the divine forces that governed their world. She looked at Lucian, at this male who'd offered her time and choice and honest vulnerability, and she made a decision that terrified her, but also felt more right than anything she'd ever done in her life. And she told him in front of Vivian and the guards and anyone else who might be listening that she chose him, not because the contract required it or the mate bond demanded it, but because in the brief time they'd spent being honest with each other, she'd seen the kind of male he was underneath the crown and the power. Someone who understood loneliness and fear and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, you weren't meant to go through life completely alone. The mate bond flared between them at her declaration, visible to everyone in the room as silver light that seemed to emanate from where their hands were joined. And Lucian's expression transformed from fury to wonder to something so tender and overwhelmed that Seraphina felt tears prick at her eyes, because nobody had ever looked at her like that before, like she was precious and valuable and exactly what they needed. He pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of 7 years of waiting and loneliness and careful control finally breaking, and he buried his face in her silver hair that matched his own, breathing in her scent like it was the air he needed to survive, and his wolf was audible in the rumbling purr that vibrated through his chest as he held his mate for the first time. Finally, after searching for her through countless failed courtships and political arrangements, and increasingly desperate hope that she existed somewhere, Serafina wrapped her arms around him and let herself lean into the embrace. Let herself accept comfort and connection and the terrifying vulnerability of being held by someone who could destroy her more thoroughly than any amount of rejection or isolation ever had. And her own wolf was singing. With joy so pure and intense, it felt like her heart might burst from the pressure of containing so much emotion after years of carefully rationing any feeling that might make her hope for things she couldn't have. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard and eyes bright with unshed tears and the overwhelming force of the mate bond settling into place, Lucian turned back to Vivian with an expression that had softened from rage to something more like pity, and he told her that she was removed from her position on the royal council effective immediately, that she would be exiled from the palace and stripped of her titles and holdings, but that he wouldn't execute her because his mate had shown him mercy even when she had every right to demand vengeance, and he would honor that mercy by extending it to someone who didn't deserve it. Vivian's face crumpled with the realization that she'd lost everything she'd spent decades building, that her attempt to control the king through his mate had backfired so spectacularly that she was being sent away in disgrace. But she had enough self-preservation left to bow her head in submission and accept the punishment without further argument. And the guards escorted her from the throne room with footsteps that echoed through the vast space like a funeral march for ambitions that had died before they could fully form. The doors closed behind them with a finality that left Serafina and Lucian alone once more in the throne room that had witnessed so many dramatic moments in the past hour. And the silence that fell between them now was completely different from the charged tension of their earlier conversation. Softer and more comfortable. The silence of two people who'd been through something intense together and come out the other side changed, but intact. Lucian took both of Serafina's hands in his thumbs stroking over her knuckles with a gentleness that made her shiver, and he asked her if she was sure, if she truly wanted to accept the mate bond and everything that came with it, the responsibility of being Luna to a kingdom, the danger of being mate to a male whose parents had been assassinated, the scrutiny of living in a palace where every action would be watched and judged, and she appreciated that he was giving her one more chance to choose, one more opportunity to walk away before they took the final irrevocable step of completing the bond. Serafina looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the silver hair and ice-blue eyes and powerful build to the male underneath, who was just as scared and lonely and desperate for connection as she'd been when she signed that contract in her cottage, what felt like a lifetime ago. And she told him with absolute certainty that yes, she was sure, that she'd spent her entire life being told she was too strange and too cursed and too different to deserve love, but that he looked at her like her differences were what made her perfect rather than what made her damaged. She told him that she'd come to this palace expecting a cold political arrangement, and maybe, if she was lucky, some basic kindness, that she'd never dared to hope for a true mate bond or genuine love or the kind of partnership her father used to describe when he talked about her mother, and that finding all of that with him felt like the moon goddess was finally answering prayers. Serafina had stopped saying years ago because she'd given up on anyone actually listening. She told him that she wanted to be his mate and his Luna and his partner in ruling this kingdom, that she wanted to stand beside him, not behind him, that she had ideas about education reform and helping wolves who'd been rejected by their packs, and modernizing the ancient laws that her father had spent his life studying, and she watched Lucian's expression shift to something that looked like awe, as he realized that his mate wasn't just beautiful and brave, but intelligent and passionate about making their kingdom better. He kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, pouring 7 years of loneliness and hope and desperate longing into the press of his lips against hers, and the mate bond sang between them with such intensity that the silver light emanating from their joined forms brightened until it filled the entire throne room with radiance that looked like captured moonlight. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air and trembling with the force of emotions too big to be contained in mortal bodies, Lucian rested his forehead against hers and told her that he wanted to court her properly despite the contract and the mate bond, that he wanted to take time to know her as a person and let her know him, that they had the rest of their lives to complete the bond, and he wanted to savor every moment of falling in love with her instead of rushing through it just because fate said they were meant to be together. Serafina agreed with a smile that felt strange on her face after years of having very little to smile about, and they made plans for a proper courtship that would scandalize the council and delight the kingdom. Walks in the gardens and shared meals and long conversations about everything and nothing, building a foundation of friendship and trust and genuine affection to support the mate bond that already connected their souls. The public mating ceremony was held 6 weeks later, under a full moon that seemed brighter than any moon Serafina had ever seen. And she wore a dress of silver silk that matched both her hair and Lucian's, standing before their kingdom as an equal partner rather than a possession or a political arrangement. When Lucian marked her neck, claiming her before the moon goddess and all witnesses, the bond completed with such power that everyone present could feel it, a wave of silver light and pure joy that radiated outward from the newly mated pair and washed over the assembled wolves with the force of divine blessing. Serafina marked him in return, claiming the Alpha King as hers with a possessiveness that made him laugh with delight. And the kingdom howled their approval of a Luna who'd proven herself brave and intelligent and worthy of standing beside their powerful ruler. The years that followed were filled with challenges and triumphs, with Serafina revolutionizing the kingdom's education system and creating sanctuaries for rejected wolves, and working alongside Lucian to modernize laws that had been outdated for generations. And through it all, the mate bond between them grew stronger and deeper, evolving from the initial overwhelming attraction into something more profound and lasting, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals, and the kind of love that her father had always told her existed, but she'd stopped believing in. When their first pups were born, twins with silver hair and eyes that shifted between ice blue and violet depending on the light, Serafina held them and thought about how she'd signed that contract expecting nothing more than survival. How she'd walked into this palace certain she was making a terrible mistake. And how the moon goddess had taken her desperation and Lucian's resignation and woven them together into something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. She told her story often to young wolves, who came to her feeling broken and unwanted, sharing how she'd been the cursed girl nobody wanted until she became the Luna everyone respected. And she emphasized that their differences weren't flaws to be hidden, but gifts to be celebrated. That somewhere out there was someone who would see their strangeness as beauty, their quirks as perfection, their damaged parts as proof they'd survived things that would have destroyed weaker wolves. Years later, when scholars wrote about the legendary Luna Serafina and her mate King Lucian, they would describe how a blind contract had brought together two souls so perfectly matched that their bond became the stuff of legend. How a desperate Omega and a resigned Alpha had found each other through manipulation and chance and created a love story that reminded every wolf in the kingdom that the moon goddess worked in mysterious ways, that sometimes the darkest moments came right before the dawn, that true mate bonds were rare and precious and worth every moment of fear and vulnerability it took to accept them. Seraphina would stand on the palace balcony in her later years, silver hair now streaked with white but still flowing long and beautiful. And she would look out over the kingdom she'd helped build, the schools and sanctuaries and reformed laws that bore her influence, and she would think about the girl she'd been in that cottage, alone and desperate and signing a contract with shaking hands, and she would be grateful for every choice that had led her to this moment, every fear she'd pushed through, every wall she'd let crumble, every time she'd chosen vulnerability over safety, because that was what had brought her to Lucian, to love, to a life so full and rich and meaningful that sometimes she could barely believe it was real. The contract they'd both signed blindly, the one that had seemed like a trap and a surrender and a last desperate grasp at survival, was framed in their private chambers as a reminder that sometimes the moon goddess worked through unlikely circumstances, that fate could find you even when you'd stopped looking for it, that the person meant for you might find you in the most unexpected way at the most desperate moment, and that signing your name to a piece of paper without knowing what the future held could be the bravest thing you ever did if it led you to exactly where you were always meant to be. If you enjoyed this story of Seraphina and Lucian, the contracted bride who became queen, and the Alpha King whose wolf fell to its knees at the sight of his true mate, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what moment resonated most with you, whether it was Seraphina's desperate choice to sign the contract, Lucian's vulnerability when he admitted his fears, or the moment they chose each other, independent of fate's demands. Please subscribe to this channel for more werewolf romance tales featuring true mates, political intrigue, rejected mates finding their place, and powerful bonds that transcend circumstances. And hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, because I have so many more stories to share about alphas and omegas and the complicated, beautiful, terrifying journey of finding the person who sees all your broken pieces and loves you, not despite them, but because of them. Leave a comment telling me what kind of werewolf romance you'd like to see next. Whether you want more Alpha King stories, rejected mate redemptions, or perhaps tales of unlikely bonds forming in impossible circumstances. Because your support and feedback help me create the content you want to read. And knowing that these stories resonate with you, that they bring you joy or comfort or a few minutes of escape from whatever challenges you're facing, means absolutely everything to me. Thank you for reading, for investing your time in Seraphina and Lucian's journey from desperate strangers to devoted mates. And I promise I'll see you in the next story with more romance, more adventure, and more proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the choices we make when we're at our lowest, when we're certain we have nothing left to lose, when we sign our names to contracts without knowing they'll lead us to exactly the person we've been searching for our entire lives.